Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's virtual coffee. I'm Jennifer Splansky-Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us. Before we start, we want to take a moment to recognize the land that we are on, your speakers and those of us behind the scenes producing today's webinar. We'd like to acknowledge that this virtual coffee is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ohlone, Nacotchek, Piscataway, Scurray, Tuscarora, Coast Salish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and the Duwamish people past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these tribes. Thank you. So I'm really happy to be with you all today, hosting today's conversation with Corianne and Andrea. It's very timely to have a conversation during which we'll be hearing a lot about the work of cross-sector initiatives in contributing to systems change, with a real focus on racial equity, power, and community engagement. The intersecting crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Black racism here in the US and abroad, prolonged economic downturn, and other challenges make this kind of work very important to learn from and to understand more deeply. And so before we dive into today's conversation to take us on this learning journey, I'm going to just spend a few minutes orienting you to more of the logistics of our virtual coffee. Our conversation will run 60 minutes. You can feel free to grab a literal cup of coffee or tea as we sit down, or water, whatever you like. The virtual coffee series is intentionally set up to be a casual learning experience where we get to hear from experts, practitioners, researchers, and others in the field about their own work. We will spend about 40 minutes of our time together hosting a discussion with today's guests, and then we'll open up to questions from you all at the end. You can put your questions in the question box. It's a Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. You can also share with others on the line in the chat, but please do use the Q&A box for questions. In addition, the session is being recorded and we'll make the recording available later today. You can keep an eye out for an email announcing when the recording is up. We also will be making the slides available as a handout if you're interested in accessing them and downloading them. They should be loaded in the chat box here, and we'll send a link after as well. So before we go farther, we want to learn a little bit about who is on the line. So we're going to launch a poll to ask you what type of organization you identify with professionally and personally as you enter this conversation. So you can see this poll up here: business, funder, nonprofit, public sector, research, consulting or technical assistance, or a different role or sector. So we'll just give a minute for folks to respond. All right, let's see. Great. So we have, you can all see the results here. So we have about nearly 45% of folks are from nonprofit, almost a quarter from the public sector or government, another 15% from research and academia, similar from consulting, about 10% from philanthropy, and a handful of folks from representing other roles or from the private sector, from business. So a really interesting, wonderful mix. Makes sense given the cross-sector orientation of many of the partnerships we'll be discussing today. Next slide. One more shout out: if you have any questions or need technical assistance, please do use the question box as well. Next slide. Well, I am just delighted to introduce today's guests and speakers that we have joining us today. So first we have Andrea Akita. She is the Director for Communities of Opportunity, a public-private initiative of the Seattle Foundation and King County to create racial, social, economic, and health equity that enables all people in the country to thrive. Communities of Opportunity supports a network of nonprofit and grassroots organizations in King County, Washington, to advance community-driven solutions at the intersection of health, housing, economic opportunity, and community connections. And joining her today, we have Corianne Scally, a Principal Research Associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she explores the design, implementation, and outcomes of affordable housing and community development policy and programs for vulnerable populations in U.S. communities, from large cities to rural towns. From evaluating federal programs to assessing philanthropic investments, her research focuses on affordable rental housing and the hardships and needs of vulnerable renters and the communities they live in. So I'm delighted to have you both with us. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to you for the next portion of our presentation. Next slide.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be with you all today. My first task is to begin the conversation on what multi-site cross-sector initiatives are and how they are working to drive systems change forward. Next slide. So what is a multi-site cross-sector initiative? The definition we used was that these are new connected sets of activities that are planned and implemented to achieve a goal, spanning more than one site. This could be a neighborhood, a school, a city, a region, and finally involving a mix of institutions from the public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors. We looked at 16 such initiatives that you can see here on your screen, funded by both government and philanthropy. And we were building upon a paper that was also published by the San Francisco Federal Reserve in 2015 called Pathways to Systems Change. So we picked up the conversation started in that paper by focusing on initiatives that either began in 2015 or that had started earlier but was still ongoing in 2015 to learn more about how these initiatives have evolved since then. Our research was informed by interviews, websites, document scans, and 2 separate research convenings that we hosted to learn from these initiatives. And if you're familiar with any of these, you'll know that they focus on a variety of issues, from health to housing to education and economic development and more. They're also quite different in terms of other characteristics, such as the number of sites that were involved, the amount of funding received to implement the work, as well as manage it, and the length of time that the funding was committed for these initiatives. Next slide. And we found that these initiatives were engaging in many systems, or the actors, activities, and settings that were influencing the problems and issues that they were focused on addressing. A lot of you are probably familiar with FSG's Water of Systems Change framework that focuses on 3 tiers of conditions necessary for systems change that are all, of course, are interconnected. That includes structural changes in policies, practices, and resources, relational change in terms of relationships and connections and power dynamics, and finally, transformative change in terms of mental models, shifting mindsets and attitudes. We found that the initiatives we observed were often promoting various types of change, but not always comprehensively and sometimes not even intentionally. For example, sometimes we found that they were focusing on resource flows as what they thought was the best target for change, but what really needed to happen first, as they often learned over time, was building relationships or perhaps giving sites direct control over setting the goals that they wanted to achieve and allocating the resources to achieve those goals. But there are a lot of positive examples out there. For example, building healthy communities across the state of California, supported by the California Endowment, helped inform 7 new state laws that were passed to address the racialized harm of school suspensions. These changes helped cut state suspensions in half, and some of the initiative communities actually saw suspensions drop to 0. Importantly, the initiative only did this after leadership was challenged by and listened to youth across multiple sites who helped them to connect race to school suspensions, to graduation rates, to long-term health outcomes for youth. Communities of opportunity, which really pleased to be here together with you with Andrea, also achieved some significant results so far, still ongoing, of course, including giving community representatives a majority role in the governance of the initiative, including the allocation of resources. Among other things, they've also analyzed their resource allocation to make sure that, that those organizations led by people of color weren't receiving disproportionately less funding. And we'll hear other great examples, I'm sure. But in sum, we found that a lot of initiatives were working particularly to shift the flow of local resources towards community priorities, and also found that regularly these initiatives are bringing unfamiliar partners together to sit at the same table regularly, often resulting in new relationships and trust building, and then of course deep peer learning as well. Next slide. So central to systems change work and addressing root causes, we found that initiatives were making progress on advancing racial equity, but unevenly, and many have far to go, honestly. We learned that racial equity is a journey that happens at multiple levels, individuals, organizations, communities, the sites themselves, and the initiatives as a whole. And that initiatives often must choose to travel down this path. And to complicate things, of course, people and organizations are at different points in their journey at the same time. And so it really takes extraordinary effort for initiatives to help advance multiple journeys wherever they are, to progress to the next level while not losing the sight of losing sight of achieving anti-racist goals across the initiative itself, which can be quite challenging, particularly when there are honestly individuals or communities or organizations that really are lagging behind on their journey. We found that advancing racial equity takes more than just flipping a switch. It really needs to be woven throughout all of the work. And this includes running from setting goals to prioritizing racial equity, to how the work gets staffed and how it's funded, to at the back end making sure that you're measuring outcomes disaggregated by race and ethnicity, to really take a close look at what you're achieving through all of the work. We did not see a lot of this deep change happening in general, but we certainly saw glimpses of it. Next slide. Finally, similar to other initiatives where you have larger, more powerful interests that are investing in marginalized people and places, there are significant power imbalances in operation that often leave sites with a lot of pressure and sometimes little agency to really affect change. And our findings highlighted how funders, intermediaries, and evaluators all really need to be strategic throughout an initiative and helping to shift power to sites, particularly by allowing sites to take risks, to learn from those risks, and to grow and evolve over time as a result. This is really a challenge to continue to work on in the future. And I look forward to discussing these themes more in our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Corianne. And I'm pleased now to invite Andrea share a little bit more about the Communities of Opportunity program specifically, how the initiative is structured, some of the goals, and a bit more of an overview.
Thank you, Jen. And it's really a pleasure to be here representing Communities of Opportunity. We believe that communities of opportunity is transforming what it means to create health and well-being in King County. And our goal, as Jen described, was really to create greater health, social, economic, and racial equity in King County so that all people thrive and prosper, regardless of where they live, regardless of their race. And we really knew that race and place matter. Our focus has been on the root cause of these inequities, which is why we have included racial equity as one of our primary goals for the work that we're doing. And we're driving systems and policy change through community partnerships and community-driven priorities and solutions. I want to say that we're really young, and we started this work in 2014 through a partnership between King County government and Seattle Foundation, which is the oldest community foundation serving the Pacific Northwest. Communities of opportunity, and we're continuing to learn and grow. So we appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation today. And then I really want to preface what I'm going to be saying, is that I represent our initiative, and I'm operating as someone who works within government as a funder and a convener. And I understand that there's many people joining today who are from the nonprofit sector, and we really want to acknowledge these practitioners who are leading and responding to the community during these dual pandemics that we're faced. And agree that it's important now more than ever that we're going to be listening carefully and really thinking about the way that we're doing this work together. We certainly don't have all of the answers to the work that we're doing.
Hey, Andrea, I'm sorry to cut in. We're having a few folks say they're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. Are you able to speak a little bit louder?
Yes,
Thank
I'll
you.
try to speak a little bit louder, and I apologize for the problems. Hopefully this will be better.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So this is, when we're talking about place, I wanted to provide a really quick flyover of the geography and some of the context for King County. And the stars on the map show the locations of some of communities of opportunity, or COO sites in King County. King County is a large area, and I appreciate that we acknowledge the Native and Indigenous peoples, and I do want to acknowledge that the place in the region that became King County is on traditional land, ancestral land that's home to the Coast Salish people, both past and present. And specifically, the land, this land is home to the Muckleshoot, the Snoqualmie, and the Duwamish tribes. And we honor the rich culture and history of the Coast Salish people, which is really vital to our region. There's about 2,100 square miles of land that makes up the area that is now King County. 2.25 million people live in King County, which is roughly 1/3 of Washington's state population. And among the people in King County, you'll find about 170 different languages spoken. There's 39 incorporated cities across the region and unincorporated county areas that include both urban, rural, and island communities. And many people know that Seattle, Greater Seattle, is the birthplace of Boeing and Starbucks, Microsoft, and Amazon. And Greater Seattle has been one of the most affluent communities in the nation. And the region had experienced tremendous economic growth over the last decade. And yet we continue to see stark disparities. And one really looks closely at health and well-being indicators at the county level. It would appear that we're doing well, but our census tract data, and data tells a different story. Next slide, please. So this is what health and well-being measures across Seattle and King County look like when they're mapped. And we call this really truth on a map. And these maps provide a snapshot of where health and economic inequities are clustered throughout King County and across a number of health and well-being indicators like life expectancy, frequent mental distress, preventable hospitalization, and as well as other indicators like income and housing affordability and employment. And when we took a look at this, we created a composite. It was really clear that virtually all of the maps started to look the same, with the worst outcomes in our county clustering in particular parts, geographic areas. And what we were seeing on the map was really a result of systems and policies that had set the conditions in place. And they were taking shape across a geographic landscape, and they were taking place across a racial landscape. And we knew that when we were looking at these maps that they were providing a real disturbing window into what our future could look like if we continued to maintain the status quo. And so we couldn't continue to do things the same way and expect for these outcomes to change. And so that kind of thinking drove us to the work that is now Communities of Opportunity. Next slide. And the colors on the map really, we needed to rethink the way that we were seeing them. And we wanted to create a new structure and a new approach. And we needed a different vision. And so when our vision is that all people in King County are going to prosper, we needed to work with community leaders and co-design an initiative in which we started focusing on the results that our community wanted to see. And the community wanted to see that people were going to thrive economically, that they were going to have quality, affordable housing, that they were healthy and connected to community, which is really about power and how the community has the ability to be engaged. And so we needed our investments to follow this form. And the next slide really lines up how our investments or our funding is. We're trying to put our money where our mouth is, and we focus on three intersecting kind of reinforcing elements. One is around geographic and cultural communities that drive change locally. We select communities, geographic areas based on the maps, where originally we wanted to work with communities that were at the lowest 20th percentile of health and well-being in our community, and then we expanded that to really include the lowest 40 percentile. And we focus both on places as well as cultural communities, or communities that are not geographically bound, because we know that not everyone has had the kind of roots that are connected to land and to location. We connect our work in place with systems and policy change, with partners that are working to dismantle persistent racial injustice within our systems. And then we wrap everything up within a learning community that really leverages collective power and knowledge to accelerate the change. We're trying to build capacity and skills, share learning and best practices, and innovate and take change to scale. Next slide, please. We're often asked, I want to rush through these so we have a chance to talk about that. We're often asked about how we're measuring success, and we have spent some time looking at the kinds of results that we want to see. We're using a results-based accountability framework, which we will be maybe the first to admit that it's not a really great fit all of the time, but it does allow us to look at big picture population health changes that we wish to see across these 4 areas. And we're trying to get more specific about what that would mean within these areas, working with our partners to really ensure that the kinds of indicators and metrics within places and then across places are getting us to greater racial equity. Finally, one of the really important parts of our initiative is our governance group, our governance structure, which is made up of a combination of community members, representatives from the King County government, and representatives from philanthropy. We're a 14-member body, and what's important is that the majority of people on our governance group are community representatives. They have deep relationships within the community, deep understanding of the community. And this body, unlike many others that are controlling resources in King County, are making decisions around how those dollars are being used. They set the budget, and then they make the awards of funding from recommendations on review panels that are also made up of community members. What you're seeing on this slide is just a representation of the values that really drive the work of our governance group, which include equity and community engagement, being data-driven and innovative, risk-taking, and being willing to fail. So that's a quick overview, and I look forward to getting into maybe some more examples about what the work we're doing.
Thank you. And thank you both for the great grounding orientation to the Research and Communities of Opportunity program. So as you've heard from Andrea and as Corianne outlined, all of the pieces, all of the different initiatives were multi-site and cross-sector in their orientation. The definition of site and community varied by initiative. And I think even within initiatives, Andrea, as you said, sometimes it was a cultural community, often also a geographic or place-based community would be the definition. But given that, I'm wondering if both of you could reflect a little bit on some of the advantages and or challenges of working in an initiative that is multi-site and cross-sector as a way of pursuing systems change.
You know, one of the big advantages in Seattle and King County to our approach is really that we wanted to be asset-based, and by doing that, we were able to, you know, working across sectors and bringing the community voice forward, knew that there were a lot of lessons that needed to be shared. So that was one of the real advantages, is to be able to make sure that the community who knew what they need and had solutions were going to be really central in that. The challenge has been, I think, something that Corianne alluded to. There's really varying capabilities that we found and different barriers to fully participate in the work across our sites and even within some of our sites. And we knew that going into the initiative. And it's really challenged us in the way that we are addressing how we're able to bring varying capabilities up so that everybody can participate fully.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add, you know, the cross-site work, that this is certainly a unique contribution from these types of initiatives. We saw a lot of evidence across sites of the value of peer learning, the ability to come together and learn from one another, to help advance shared goals and best practices. I think this is particularly true when the goals are aligned across sites that are working perhaps in a single city or county, as in communities of opportunity, or even within a state where we actually saw partnerships forming to work together for change even at the state level. Some of the disadvantages come in terms of measuring change. It's certainly not a disadvantage that sometimes sites are pursuing different types of goals across them. But since I know there are some evaluators and funders joining us today that think about impacts, for example, this definitely can make it challenging to understand what change is occurring over time across all of the sites engaged. And this isn't just for impact measurement necessarily, but also for understanding what changes might need to actually occur to make sure that sites are, being properly supported to most effectively pursue their goals. I think across initiatives as well, we saw current initiatives building upon past ones, which I think is heartening for the field when we wrestle sometimes with what appear to be short-term commitments compared, of course, to the decades and sometimes centuries that the systems that hold today's problems in place have evolved over. And so it was encouraging to see initiatives such as communities of opportunity building on other work that had been seeded in the case of communities of opportunity by the integration initiative funded through Living Cities. And so being able to see that work build, I think, was an encouraging outcome of our scan.
Great. So we've begun to dig into communities of opportunity a little bit, but I see a bunch of questions coming in that are more specific to that in the chat. So I'm going to ask a couple more and then turn over to some of the participant Q&A. But Andrea, I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit more about some of the additional lessons learned that you have from the work, particularly with respect to advancing systems change. So any examples or any other lessons learned you'd want to touch on?
I'd love to talk a little bit about the importance with the systems change work that we've been doing, to have a partnership between King County and the Seattle Foundation. So with the resources that we've been able to blend, um, our our public dollars are extremely limited in their ability to do particular kinds of advocacy and lobbying work. And so the beauty of having a philanthropic partner was that we were able to really combine resources in ways that were going to allow us to be more flexible and our partners more flexible to work at particular policy and systems change at the state level and with specific kinds of legislative activities. And we've seen a lot of success as a result of that. I think that probably some of the other things that I would maybe mention are, I talked a little bit about the varying capabilities or the capacities that we've been seeing across our partnerships. And one of the other things that, has been really important for us is to be able to ensure that we have resources that are going to help in the learning and the training and the workshops, and not just, training that's coming from experts, but there's a wealth of experience and knowledge that exists within our communities, but it's not always connected in particular ways. And then the other thing specifically that we've done is to be able to look at a framework around capacity development that is rooted in what it would take to actualize equity. So an equity in action model that looks at the organizational stability of organizations as one component, knowledge and issues of the landscape in which we're working, the ability to create strong partnerships, which is often really overlooked, I think, and one of the lessons for us, and then what it takes to build critical power and political power in that. And we're just starting to launch kind of what those components will look like. And we recognize that we need to have all of those occurring kind of simultaneously. We can't really just focus on one or another. And that's a challenge for us. I think in terms of the, mentioning kind of the idea that it takes time and resources to do this work. Partnership's critical, collaboration's critical, and we know that takes resources. And our partners have told us that we need to go slow in order to go fast. And the work of building kind of that solid partner team that's strong and has shared working agreements, ability to meet regularly has been a key factor in their success. But it took a lot longer before, they felt that they had anything to show for the work, but we knew that the work was happening. And that's often a challenge that we see with a lot of funders, and even we as funders trying to help other people in the county understand that.
Yes. I'm curious when you talk about the capacity building work, Andrea, the different dimensions that you mentioned. Can you say a little bit more about like who's the participant and the recipient in when you think about that capacity building work?
Initially our capacity building work is really focused within our community partnerships. And we recognize too that as a funder, we need to have some, often bring in more neutral facilitators within that and allow our partners to really be able to have that space. We've contracted with groups that are helping to build the capacity within their organizations and then carry this work forward. So I think it's operating at a few levels, really the partners who are going to be taking this work, implementing the work, as well as some of the our organizations here in King County that can develop models to do this. So when we were talking about our framework, for example, the group that helped us develop that is a local group that has worked for decades helping the nonprofit community with different capacity and a particular trusted, again, person within the community to help develop those tools.
Great.
And then I think that one area that we are trying to do more of is in the training within King County. So we operate within a system. And so really there's some training that happens, maybe not always formally, but informally around the needs of our partners and how that we can change the ways in which we're doing things, the practices and the norms.
Great, thank you. So as we mentioned at the top of the webinar, we all know we're finding ourselves in challenging times right now, to say the least. And I'm curious how, this is questions for both of you. Do you think that the pandemic and the calls for racial justice that we are experiencing now will affect or accelerate or hinder our ability to drive this kind of systems change forward, shifting power, advancing racial equity? How do you reflect on this work in this current moment? And Andrea, if you could speak as loud as possible for this one. I got another few notes that would be super helpful. Thank you.
I'll start. Thank you. And I'm so sorry. I'm trying to yell and deliver this, but I hopefully
we'll take your best. We'll take your best.
Great. Thank you. One of the things that we know from the work that we're doing is that money is disorganizing. And then I think scarcity is going to even exacerbate that further. And so the strong partnerships that we are creating are going to be so important that we can work together. And I have a lot of hope that we're going to be able to do that. In King County, we have recently declared racism as a public health crisis, and an acknowledgement that the transformation that needs to happen has to start here, and it has to start with us. And so one of the things that I think gives me hope is that throughout this declaration, there were a number of things that the county has acknowledged that need to happen in terms of putting community first and having community solutions lead. And so many of the things feel like they're textbook sort of communities of opportunity. And it's not by lack of design that way. I mean, the county has been supporting this work, and we've been a model, and now it allows us to kind of further that model throughout the work that we're doing. It's not going to be easy by any means, and I think that the support and that has to happen for our providers is really critical right now. Corianne?
Yeah, I think that, in the midst of these difficult times, I think there's an opportunity to really center equity in recovery, in response and recovery to what's happening today. And so I think that there's, along with that, more willing audience, people who are prepared to hear those things now, who, beforehand, maybe when you went and knocked on their door for a partnership, you were turned away because they really weren't on the same page with what you were trying to achieve, or again, what residents, cultural communities and other types of communities really needed to see happen. And so I think there's a great opportunity here to really leverage the shifts, hopefully, the mindset shifts that are occurring within individuals and within organizations and funders and others to knock on their doors again, and hopefully having your ideas be better received than they have been in the past.
Thank you. Yeah, we hope so. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are coming in from folks on the line. And the first one, I think I will ask Andrea to you about the communities of opportunity work, but Corianne, if there are other examples that you see in the research, please by all means add. And the question is, were there any challenges that you experienced due to power and power dynamics between nonprofit, public, funding partners, and residents, community members, when you're bringing all those different perspectives together at a table, and how you mitigate the real and the perceived and real power dynamics that bringing folks together present.
Conflict is inherent in the work, and we are reminded of that. What we hope to do is make the conflict part of really transformative change. And so we're learning about that. We have invited different folks to start the work with communities of opportunity to do that, both at a different place or site-based level, as well as, throughout the initiative for our governance body, our staff. We need to be able to have this work happen as part of work that's going to continue to build the relationships that we have with one another. And so they are absolutely real. We go through them with our partners. We, as a funder, recognize the power that we have in setting some of the contractual and very transactional relationships that we have that are not always, in service to the kinds of goals and outcomes that our community partners want to see. That being said, I think we are making progress on how we're able to change that. But we also rely pretty much on our partners within the community, the tables that they have set to be able to work together through those changes. We've offered, interestingly, we've offered to have facilitation available. And sometimes, there's a sense that no, facilitation and someone outside is maybe not going to help us as much and could harm us. And so there's really some thought that needs to go into, all of the different ways in which they're approaching it. So, I don't think there's a magic recipe for it, as much as, this kind of openness and struggle to wanting to get through that, and acknowledgement that it's going to happen. And so what are the tools that we can have in place and prepare for that and learn from them?
Yeah. And this is just a kind of related question, is more of a clarification. When you're talking, I guess, in the research broadly, and then also, Andrea, in Seattle, King County, when you talk about community, I know that you, I believe for community opportunities, you said sometimes it's neighborhood, like place-based, sometimes cultural identity. So I want to check that. And then also, Corianne, when you saw different and across different initiatives, how was kind of the community being defined? Another dimension of community, is it residents or community organizations? So just some additional clarity there, and then I have a follow-up.
Sure, I can speak broadly across initiatives that we looked at, and the unsatisfactory answer is it depends. I think communities of opportunity embraced a very broad definition. I think oftentimes we see initiatives choosing a place-based definition, so kind of delineating a geography of interest. Sometimes they define community based on the actors that they wanted to really have at the table. So for example, say an anchor institution like a hospital, or some other organization that, when you think of a hospital service area, where they draw their patients from, and might be have concerns, be concerned for the health and well-being of community, that geography and space or the populations and subpopulations within that would be very different. So it really ranged, and definitely we saw place-based definitions, and as well as definitions that were really focused on particular people, regardless of where they may reside.
Okay, great. Did you want to add to that, Andrea? No? Okay. Another related question is, related to the thread of questions. Can you speak to some of the challenges of reconciling the very understandable demand for more rapid policy change, centering equity right now, with the very or often slow rate of change needed for shifting mental models around the kind of work that we are hoping is being embraced right now? How do you enact systems change in a time of intense political polarization around racially charged issues? No silver
I'm
bullet.
going to let Andrea go first on that as the practitioner.
Oh, we started our initiative wanting to be very bold, and looking back at what was bold in 2014 and 2015 and what's bold now, huge difference, and which gives us more opportunity to be bolder. We're trying to be stronger and clearer, more precise in what we're doing in talking about racial equity. And for example, we are going to release an RFP soon that really focuses on leadership in the Black community. And that might not seem as sort of earth-shattering to say based on all of the data and information that we've seen, but it was a big move for us to be able to name specific goal and outcome and community that we wanted and we needed to see lead our efforts of change. We are in a very progressive bubble here in King County. And so I think that, that where we have to move and how we have to move that is really different from others, but it still exists. And so we, look to as many allies and partners who can do that work. We fund at a lot of different levels across systems and policy change to continue to move toward that. But I think we struggle with it like others, but we need to, we are finding we need to be more bold in our assertions about what we're saying and doing.
I think from the research, I'd like to just tack on a couple of additional points. I think that we definitely saw evidence of funders really often in the philanthropic sector really using their power to shift the narrative themselves. By funding these initiatives, for example, oftentimes that gave cover. If there was, say, a focus on racial equity, an explicit focus stated within the goals of the initiative, that really allowed the sites under that initiative to be bold. And so that, I think that's something that came across to us as very helpful in that narrative. I also just think it's worth circling back to the idea of multiple sites. And I think that that if you think of power as really being multiplied through efforts kind of coming together around shared goals to really tackle systems together, I do think that we saw that across these initiatives, that really having multiple sites, however those were defined, working together towards similar change, really had some significant outcomes that may not have happened kind of without that ability to leverage one another's work and honestly to leverage one another's power in a shared way.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to bundle a couple questions for you to dig into around the role of funders. So one question was around sort of the role of funders just generally in the initiative. So in some scenarios, were funders sort of catalysts and then step back, or did funders often remain involved over the course of an initiative? So if you talk a little bit about the role of funder in the sort of in the origin of the initiative and then over the lifespan of the initiatives. And then another related question is, do funders understand the importance of the role of the backbone or intermediary and why it should be funded. And I hear in there any advice that you have for people playing that role in securing funding for their role as an intermediary or a backbone.
Sure. So I can talk briefly from our research. So there's a question about the funder and the role of the funder, and then a question about backbone organizations and intermediaries. I think, again, we saw great diversity in the relationships that the funders had, say, with the sites themselves. Sometimes we saw the case where a funder had its own staff, mobilized its own staff, say, to serve as local intermediaries for site level work, kind of as program managers, so to speak, and that enabled sites to sometimes have a direct connection to the funder then. I think that was probably the exception more than the norm, which is often that funders stick to what they do best, which is fund good work, and often reached out to get assistance with managing complex initiatives across multiple sites. And so we did see that in often cases, they would perhaps channel the funding through an intermediary organization that did more of the management across sites. I do, it was common for funders to commit to a specific period of time. I already mentioned that oftentimes the time frame was short, probably compared to the need and what it takes to change systems. But usually there was that commitment made upfront so that sites understood how long that the funding was going to be available for them to do that particular type of work. So I don't think there was I'm not familiar with the case where the funders, say, just kind of backed out and left without the sites kind of understanding when that would happen. Not to say that that certainly does have an effect when the funding, of course, comes to an end.
In Seattle and King County, I think the role of the funders, particularly with our philanthropic partners at the origin of communities of opportunity, there was far greater trust among community members who've been sticking it out with us and who have actually shown a degree of risk to be wanting to work in this way with the government. And are we really going to come through on what we are saying? And our philanthropic partners, Seattle Foundation, was able to bring people to the table in a way that has benefited our ability to design, co-design, and implement the work. I think that we play off of each other's strengths, and I think Corianne said something about really the leverage that our philanthropic partner, Seattle Foundation, and others are able to bring in convincing our electeds and in providing dollars that show their commitment to this partnership, and then in trying to convince others that government is worth risking a little bit of kind of their time and energy and resources on. In terms of cross-sector work, we talk a lot about the trust that needs to be established between the community and the funder. And we find that there's some trust that needs to be established between government and other funders and philanthropy specifically, I think. And the ability for not every philanthropic partner or government partner who's going to bring resources to the table gets a seat at the table. And actually, we see some partners say, okay, we'll just do it a little bit differently in government, not necessarily philanthropy. But there's that trust building that has to be established. The backbone, regarding backbone work, that has been really complicated for us. We provided resources at the outset and made sure that our original place-based partners, 3 of our partnerships, had resources to be able to set a table and to come up with their priorities and work together and work with us. And there was a great understanding of that. And everyone did it differently. And we didn't have a lot of guideposts for that. Now that our partnerships are in different places, I think we are really rethinking what it should look like. We went kind of from one direction where we didn't have a lot of structure to it, to moving to where there's more structure, and what we thought funders thought would be a structure for backbone. And I think we're determining what's going to work, and it's not going to, I don't believe it'll look the same for each of our partnerships and our sites moving forward.
Thank you for those reflections. I'm going to ask one last question before we turn to closing out. This is more of a kind of concrete tactical question for the practitioners out there. So in doing cross-site, cross-sectional work, what strategies and techniques work well to support coordination and collaboration across the different sites? Any advice?
Andrea, do you want to talk about how you do that?
Could you
first?
I'm sorry, Jen, will you repeat your question?
Sure, yeah. Any kind of concrete advice for strategies or techniques to support coordination or collaboration across sites?
We are bringing people, trying to bring people together in different ways, and so that we keep hearing that our partners across all these places want to get together. They want to learn from each other. They have things to share, and so that, I think that's the concrete advice, is you can't communicate enough. You can't try to bring people together enough, and it can't always be programmed. That's the other thing that we hear constantly, that we sometimes think that there's some reason that we need to bring people together, and they want to come together and have those conversations amongst themselves, together, and do that. The challenge right now is really not overtaxing people and respecting the multiple demands that they have, and not, feeling like this is another thing that they have to do to be part of COO, but really is an opportunity for.
Great. And Corianne, any other trends you saw across the sites you researched if you looked into that?
Just a lot of intentional coming together, as Andrea already discussed, through convenings, national convenings, but also maybe regional convenings as appropriate. Also, pre-COVID, leveraging the ability to visit one another site to site was often, was not often enough, but sometimes present and pointed to as a great way to bring people together, particularly, again, if they're really working towards a similar goal, where they can really learn from perhaps a site that's a little further along in their journey.
Great. Well, with that, I think that will be our last question for today. I wish we could have the opportunity to pick your brains for much longer, but we are really grateful for the time you've been able to spend with us in our network today. So thank you. And for those of you on the line that took time, as you have been juggling so much in your worlds, thank you for joining us as well. I just wanted to mention that if anyone is interested in continuing on conversations like this, the Collective Impact Forum is hosting a workshop in a few weeks called Champions for Change. This is, I think, our 7th annual Champions for Change, our first virtual one, where we'll be doing really concrete training sessions on planning and advancing your collective impact work. And this is really geared towards those playing that intermediary or backbone role, and those who are in the early to beginning stages of their work. So we would invite anyone to check that out if you're interested in joining us for 3 days of conversations like this. And then if you are also interested in a different format, we have a relatively recently launched podcast that you can access on any of the major platforms for podcasting. And thank you to our colleague, Tracy Timmons-Gray, for hosting today's session on the back end and being our podcast champion to bring this format to everyone as well. So with that, I would like to just thank everyone again for joining, and I hope everyone has a terrific afternoon and evening. Be well.